Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels Podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist, now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people, and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. Our guest today is Randy Doyal, the now retired longtime manager of Alcorn Clean Fuels in Claremont, Minnesota. Welcome to the Homegrown Fuels Podcast, Randy. I understand you got your start in ethanol sort of by accident, or maybe it was providential. Tell us your story.
It was definitely providential because I'm not smart enough to do this stuff, right? It has to be. But I was a bivocational minister, meaning I was pastoring a church that really couldn't afford to pay. And I was doing carpentry, actually, to make a living. But we ran into a tough time where nothing was being built and I was really struggling. I had a friend tell me, well, they're building something up by the old feed mill on the hill. This was in Portales, New Mexico. And I said, well, if they're building something, they'll need a carpenter, surely. So I went up, interviewed, and they were building ethanol plants. Their plan was to build 8 1 million gallon ethanol plants in a circle around what they were going to build as a central boiler. That was the plan. I didn't know. I didn't care. They just needed a carpenter, somebody to build the forms for the concrete, things like that. So I did that. I agreed to come to work for them, and they told me, well, you'll meet Jay in the morning. He'll meet you in the parking lot. Okay. So I came in with my tools, and this fellow came up and says, I'm Jay, come with me. And I followed him, and there was one plant that was operating. They were building the second one. He told me, set your tools down here. And then he took me on a tour through the facility, and he's talking, and all I'm hearing is jabbering because it's loud and it's hot and it smells funny. And we walked through it, and then he said, okay, go do that. I said, do what? He said, you're my cooker. I said, no, I'm a carpenter. He said, no, you're my cooker. If you want the job, that's what you'll do. So the other fellow at the plant, the distiller, there were the 2 jobs, the cooker and the distiller in the little plant, told me what to do, but he couldn't tell me why. But anyway, at the end of the day, I went home and covered with grain dust, and I'd gotten pretty sweaty, and I walked in with books under my arm because I stopped at the library to find anything I could find on making alcohol because nobody could tell me what we were doing or why. So I walked in, and my wife, Sonia, looked at the book. She said, what's that for? I said, we got to do some research. She was used to me doing that, studying for sermons and things like that. So, fine. She looked at me. She said, what have you been doing? I've been at work. What were you doing at work? Cooking? Cooking what? Cooking grain. Cooking grain? To do what? To make alcohol. And she freaked out. She said, oh my gosh, they'll kick you out of the church. We're Southern Baptists, And I said, well, babe, if my boss could turn water into wine, surely I can turn grain into alcohol. That was my start. And I wound up being in the industry for 40 years. It really was a calling.
What kind of operation was it? 1 million gallons? What were you converting?
We were converting almost any grain we could get our hands on, whatever was cheap. That was what we used. So if it was off-spec grain, we got it in these little plants. That's what they used because it was the cheapest source. We used primarily grain sorghum because that's what's grown in that part of the world a lot. But actually got to use almost anything. I used tapioca. Was a shipment of tapioca that was bad. Well, it's got starch in it. It works. Wheat was my favorite. Now, like I've said, it smells really good, but you can't keep it in the fermenter. It foams over pretty bad, but it smells really good. And we didn't use corn because corn was way too valuable in that part of the world. Never got any off-spec corn.
Okay.
But
okay. Was that grew into a 10 million gallon plant? Was that same outfit, or is it a different group?
No, it was a different facility. So these were little investor-owned facilities from an organization out of Salt Lake City called Mountain Development Corporation. There was another plant that started being constructed in Dallas, down the hill from this, right at the edge of town, and it was called Energy Fuels Development Corporation. It was what I thought was huge. It was 10 million gallons per year. And I actually went to work there as a carpenter, doing construction, finishing the construction. But by the time the plant was finished, the people who were building it, the owners, got me and said, well, the engineer said, we need to talk to you because you know more about this plant than anybody. How? It's just been built. I said, well, the engineer said that every time you were constructing something, you'd say, what's this? What's it for? How does it work? Because I was curious. I wanted to know. I thought it was really something. It was, and in all honesty, that was a very technologically advanced plant. Far more advanced than the plants that came up to Minnesota to see. But
in what ways? What were some of the things they were doing?
Well, mechanical vapor recompression is a way to do the evaporation, and the distillation and evaporation were tied together really well. Also, CO2 recovery, where they were selling it for beverage grade. So that was really something. It had two boiler systems, one coal and one natural gas. That was very interesting. And it had a steam tube dryer system. In the little plants, we didn't dry feed. We just gave away what we could. But, you could see the value there. And I kept thinking, well, what if you could dry this? And at this plant, we could dry the feed. And it was really something else. So,
cool. And that plant also used mostly milo and other grains, or what did you use there?
Grain sorghum, milo. That was it.
Milo.
Really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
That was the most abundant grain and the most available in that part of the world.
So there was a farmer behind a lot of the impetus to support ethanol in New Mexico?
Yes, Hoyt Pattison. Hoyt was quite a character, a very sharp guy, incredibly sharp. Got himself elected to the House of Representatives for New Mexico, from Clovis, New Mexico. He was a real conservative guy, I would call him a straight line Republican kind of guy. But Hoyt was also very interested in using the resources that we had. He built his own windmill systems for generating electricity off of old windmill towers, just, from the farm kind of thing. And he thought that was a good thing to do because the wind was there. Why not use it? And it certainly blows. So why not use it? But he could see the value of producing energy from our farms. He could see the value for the farmers. And he also understood, when we had a conversation about it, he understood the value that would be there from the feed that we're producing. And he really got that as well. As a matter of fact, Hoyt was the one who got the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association to back us. And that was really something because, so many livestock producers didn't want anything to do with ethanol because they felt like it was competing for their grain. I understand that, but Hoyt was good at that. He did some very interesting things promoting the adoption of ethanol in Minnesota, in New Mexico, and that was really something.
Oh yeah, did he do something with a butane burner or something? Did you tell me?
He was trying to explain to the folks in the legislature why you should be using ethanol because it burns so cleanly. And he said, in places that are trying to clean up their air, and air pollution from our petroleum was a big thing back then. People were finally figuring out smog was bad in cities. And he's saying, well, here's something we could do about it. And so to try to help the legislators understand it, he brought a couple of, lab scale Bunsen burners in. One was filled with ethanol and the other was filled with gasoline. He set them on the table and he said, now let me show you how this works. And he lit off the one with ethanol and they couldn't see any flame. They didn't worry about it. He says, this is how cleanly this burns. You can't see any smoke or anything off of it. And then he lit one that had gasoline in it. And of course, you could see the flame and it was very obvious and smoking like crazy. So the guards came in and basically arrested him. He was afraid he was going to get kicked out, but they understood that he was trying to make a point, and they kind of got it. New Mexico got behind it.
Got behind it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this was what, the early 1980s?
Yes.
Late 1970s, early 80s. Okay.
Early 80s.
Okay. Well, Mexico was one of those cities, or was it Albuquerque, that was having problems with clean air?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the Albuquerque was the first city to require 10% ethanol. And the mayor of Albuquerque got into a bet with the mayor of Denver and the mayor of Phoenix about who could do the most to clean up their air in a year. And they did other things as well. They did inspections on cars that they instituted, but the results, of the following year showed that Albuquerque had cleaned up its air better than Denver and Phoenix. So he won.
And he won the bet. All right.
Yeah, he won the bet.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, people, we sometimes don't appreciate that New Mexico, which is a long ways from the Corn Belt, was one of the early adopters of ethanol. That's cool.
Yes.
That's cool. How did you end up in Claremont, Minnesota?
Well, that 10 million gallon plant that I was talking about, it was very technologically advanced, but very expensive. And the original owner couldn't afford it, couldn't pay for it. So it went back to the banks. The banks actually let us operate it for a year while they tried to market it. And then it was purchased by Giant Refining. Giant has a big refinery in New Mexico, but they're also a convenience store chain that were from Arizona, based out of Scottsdale. And Giant had their own way of doing things, and they did not understand the grain markets or commodities at all. And the year that we had the huge run-up in commodity prices, I don't know if you remember 1995, where corn prices, first time ever, went over $5 a bushel. That was huge. And again, that was back in 1995. Giant chose not to do any hedging or anything else. And they told our grain person, you can't forward contract, you can't do anything. And he wasn't supposed to tell any of us in operations about it. I mentioned something about, well, I'm glad you've got everything, forward contracted, because this grain price is really going through the roof. He said, I need to talk to you. And he said, Giant chose not to buy anything. I said, then they're going to shut us down. They're going to close up shop. And he said, yeah, I think they are. Because their thought was, okay, we'll just lay everybody off and shut it down until the prices come back around, and they would start it back up again. That was their plan, I think. Anyway, I called my boss in Scottsdale and said, hey, I understand you guys are going to shut the plant down. And he said, well, I don't know. I had an idea about, taking a sabbatical. I knew they'd want me to stay. They'd want to keep staff on that could, train people and get the place running again. I understood that, but I didn't want to sit in a shut down plant for a year. I wanted to go out and do something, and I knew that there were other plants being built, and had talked to a friend who said, yeah, we could use you for startup and some of these. I thought, okay, great, I'll do that, Anyway, he said, well, I'll take it to the board. And he called me one afternoon and said, the board's afraid that you won't come back from sabbatical. So no, we're not going to grant that. And I said, well, I told you I can't sit in a shutdown plant, and hung up the phone and then hit me. Oh my gosh, you idiot. You just quit. And you don't have anything else locked up. No joke. Another God thing here. Within 10 minutes, Bruce Jordan, who used to be my boss in Portales, called and said, so what are you going to do with the plant down there? And he gave me two names of people to call in Minnesota. He said, they're looking for a general manager. I said, oh, Bruce, I'm operations guy. He goes, oh, you can run a church, you can run a co-op. Okay. So I called the first one twice and nobody answered. That gentleman was a farmer. He was out on the farm. Called the second one and got an answer. His name is Roger Johnson, and he was in the basement of the bank in Claremont. That's where they'd set up office for Alcorn. And he said, well, I think the board's already got somebody hired, but, send me your resume and I'll show it to them. I said, okay, I'll get something worked together. He says, well, you got to get it to me now because the bank closes in 15 minutes. You've got to fax that to me now. Well, okay, I don't even remember what I wrote. I sent something thinking, okay, I'll redo this tomorrow, and get it, dressed up or whatever. But faxed it off to him. I thought, yeah, they've already got somebody else hired, but at least this gives me a, first step of getting the resume ready, right? 9:00 that night, which is 10:00 Minnesota time, I got a call from Roger, and he says, the board wants to meet you. How quick can you get up here? Wow. And that's how I wound up going to Minnesota. When I came up to interview with the board, I told them that, I'd really been praying about what I should be doing. And one of the board members, Orla Toquam, looked at me and says, I've been praying that God would bring us somebody too. Wow. Okay. You can't make that stuff up. It's amazing.
Well, and they gave you a stack of papers and newsletters and things to take a look at. And what was your impression?
Well, so Roger was really good, but he wanted me to understand, the company and what they were trying to do. And I didn't understand the whole co-op thing at all. The fact that the people who were members of the co-op, farmers, had invested money. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I looked at the documents that they had signed, and they not only invested money, but they guaranteed that for every unit they held, every share they held, they were delivering 1 bushel of corn per year. And they were committed to that. So they were creating their own market, but also supporting it. And they agreed to a statement that says, and if the company can't afford to pay full value for the corn, we can put it on the books and you get paid later. They agreed to that. I mean, they were willing to support it. And I thought, wow, if they could commit to something like that, maybe I could commit to working for them. That really impressed me, what those farmers were willing to do, the risk that they were willing to take. Holy cow. They really do take a lot of risk. But their whole hope was to create a new market for themselves, get a little boost. And they were really going, to the end to make it happen.
In those days, that was a 50 million gallon a year plant? How big?
It was a 10 million gallon per year plant, yes.
Okay.
That's what it was built as.
All right. So was it really different from what you were doing down in Portales?
Yes, it was. It was, when I came to Minnesota, I began to understand what was going on and why uh, they were building plants the way they were, because they were trying to do it as cheaply as possible. Again, the plant Portalis was incredibly expensive, and I was understood they're trying to make something that is maybe, not top notch, but, sustainable, perhaps, something they can afford to do. So there were some, I would say, some gaps in technology. It was a little bit, backwards in a lot of ways, but, there was also a lot of room to make improvements and changes. And that was really good. When I looked at the design of the plant and then toured a plant built identical to it the year prior, I saw that, yes, this is going to operate, and there's ways that we can tweak this to make it operate even better. And we've never stopped.
Well, if you started at 10, go ahead.
That first year, I told the board, we've got to add a little bit to this because we can get this up to 15 million real quickly. And we've been expanding, it seems like almost nonstop ever since. And now the plant's running at almost 140 million pace. Same place. So
same place. Yeah. Was it different running corn?
Yes. I actually felt kind of spoiled that I got to run corn. That was kind of nice because, couldn't use it in New Mexico. It was too expensive. But it also, corn has the oil, the fat in corn, it works itself a little bit freer, and it coats the top of the fermenter, the fermentation, so that it doesn't foam over, and you can fill a fermenter fuller. So that meant, you've got a little more time in the vessels that you had. That volume translates to time. That gives you more time to get the job done, and it didn't foam over. And I really liked that. I also knew, though, that that increased, fat content would be even better for the dairies. Dairies came to New Mexico and built around our plant because the products that we're making, as dairy feed, increased their fat level and increased their value, and they understood that really well. Well, I thought this is going to be even better, with a little higher fat content.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, was it hard to get DDGs moving in those early days? I mean, I heard a bunch of people dumped their distillers' grains because they had no markets for them.
Oh, that's horrifying thought. No, it took some education, I will say, because, I was shocked when I came to Minnesota and dairies were saying, "Oh no, you can't feed this stuff; it's bad." And you try to say, "Wait, here's what will happen when you feed it. Your milk fat content will go up, and you'll get more value." Oh no, it won't work. Gals were like, "Yeah, they do." had to go through that, but also getting it into hog rations. And we had to do a lot of testing at the University of Minnesota so that people could see it, but it wound up, in hog rations, turkey rations, and there's plenty of market, but getting people to understand the market was tough. Fortunately, there was a great company already in Minnesota that had actually been selling my distillers in New Mexico. And, they knew the markets, and we really didn't have any issues at all in finding a home for our distillers.
Oh, good.
We, a lot of places sold the wet feed, that didn't have to dry it, and sold it for next to nothing. We sold wet feed once. And had someone who wanted some very badly, and our marketer said, "Please, can you do this?" Well, okay, we'll make you some wet cake, for this person, but everything else we dried, and because you can ship it farther and it stores better, and you get all of the ingredients on it, so it's a better feed.
So you also did some interesting, innovative things back in the day to market your ethanol. Can you tell that story?
Well, yeah. So when I was looking at coming to Minnesota, I realized that there are already ethanol plants existing here, and one of the issues is going to be, how do you market your ethanol? How do you sell it? Well, what's the market going to be? The market is going to be where the cars are. Well, duh, just look north and say, the Twin Cities. That's where the market's going to be. Okay, so I looked around to see what plants would be close there, because I was thinking, if you could work together with another plant, you'd be better off. And Heartland Corn Products was about the same distance from the cities as Alcorn was. And so when I came up to interview, I went over and got to tour that facility. That was the one that was built a year before us. Met the general manager there, and he had a marketing person, somebody who was selling all their stuff. And I pointed to him. I said, "So what does this guy do for you?" And he said, "Well, he sits on his butt half the time." And I said, "Okay, well, if I take this job, how about he sits on his butt half the time at my place, and I'll pay half his salary?" And he got really excited. "Oh yeah, well, if you come up, that'd be great." Because he thought first it's going to save him time, and he thought this person wasn't working very hard. He didn't know that person. That was Ben Brown, and Ben was really he knew marketing, and he really had a touch for it. Ben started marketing for both of us, and he spent half the week in one place and half the week in the other. He was really good about that. And he finally came to both of us and said, "Hey, look, guys, this isn't working. I've got trucks are crossing each other. Would you agree to just let me sell your products, and I'll load it from wherever it makes the most sense. And then at the end of the month, we'll just split it up and, figure it out." Okay. I like that thought, that we would actually be marketing together, and really weren't, trying to do anything that would hurt the other plant at all. That's the way it ought to be. And Ben did a really good job at that, and did so well that other plants in the state said, "Hey, we want to do the same thing." And so we put a group of plants together and formed a company called Renewable Products Marketing Group. By that time, Ben was now the general manager at Heartland, and he had someone else that he had trained. Todd took over the marketing, and Todd continues to do that at RPMG. At RPMG, we started with 20 million gallons per year of ethanol to sell, and we're selling over 2 billion gallons a year, plus all the other co-products. It's a fabulous group of folks there that really take care of the issues and do a great job.
Yeah, I bet. So do you have other stories from those days that people working in the industry now would appreciate or need to hear?
Well, one of the things that in Portales, my closest ethanol plant was Wichita, Kansas.
Oh my.
That's not very close. All the little plants had long gone away, and that was the closest plant. Of course, that means I got to know Dave Vandergren, but that was our closest plant. And I thought, coming to Minnesota, wouldn't it be great, because plants will be closer together, and you get to know people and get to visit. Dave and I did that. We talked about things back and forth, and helped each other. So I thought that'd be great. Well, that wasn't the case. In Minnesota, plants were told, that they couldn't let anybody come look at their plant because their plant was better than anybody else's. And, they weren't working together. They thought that they had to be, they were in competition with each other instead of collaboration. And that just didn't seem right. So the same called Bruce Jordan, again, the guy who used to be my boss, was up here in Minnesota. And I said, Bruce, why don't plants work together up here? And he said, well, why don't you do something about it? I thought, okay. So my thought was, okay, well, one way to get people to think about working together is what happens when something doesn't work, right? In the middle of the night when, a motor breaks down or, a valve quits working or whatever, would it be nice to know that there's a neighbor plant that's not that far away that might have the same piece of equipment, sitting there that you could borrow, and, use their spare parts, and get yourself back up and running in a hurry. And so I started calling these other plants saying, hey, why don't we get together? Let's look at what we've got for inventory, for parts, so much of our equipment is really the same. I mean, we may think that we're different, but really so much of this is the same. Wouldn't it be nice to know if there was a supply somewhere that you could tap into if you really had to have it in an emergency and you could keep your plant operating? And people were saying, yeah. So we'll come on over to Claremont and let's all meet here. Let's talk about this. I said, then I'll take you out to the plant. And they were freaked out. They thought you couldn't do that. I said, yeah, you can. It's our plant. Come look at it. You're welcome to look at it. I'll show you anything you want, answer any questions that you want, show you anything that we're doing so that we understand what we're doing. And that started a process of us going and visiting other plants and starting that communication. And that really has helped. And that practice of collaboration has really helped the industry grow so much. It helps people learn and avoid some of the same stupid mistakes that we've made. That's really helpful. And hopefully somebody can share their mistakes so you don't have to do that either. That really helps. But, we face so much of the same issues, we can maybe work together and come up with better ideas and make things really more efficient. And that collaboration really goes throughout the industry.
Yeah, but that collaboration, sharing mistakes requires a certain amount of humility, I think. It's not easy to say, this really went wrong. Of course, some of these mistakes are so obvious that all your neighbors know, what was going on there?
Yeah, but it's there's some of that reluctance to share. But if you do share, okay, admit that you were an idiot at this point, but learn from it. Because if you can't admit that you made a mistake, you won't learn and you won't improve.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you have any good story about one of those mistakes that was quite a learning curve? That it ended up that what we just didn't know, and boy, we've learned a lot.
I don't know that I would, I don't have a real story about a mistake, but one of the things that really seemed to be an issue for folks was the amount of water that ethanol plants would consume.
Mm-hmm.
When our plant was built, it was the first plant that was not discharging to any municipal sewer system or whatever, right? It was taking care of everything in-house. The only water that we were discharging went into a judicial ditch, system, and we had to test it. It had to meet very high standards. It was water from our RO system and
your reverse osmosis, yeah.
So we had to check and make sure that it was all okay and keep records of it, But I found myself thinking, is there ways that we can use those water streams? And we started working on it, figured out ways that we could use that. And we became the first plant to go zero liquid discharge. We found ways to put it back in the process. And we've shared that with people so that, it's improved our efficiencies in that regard. And we've tried to do that with everything, trying to improve the yield and the efficiency in our dryer system. Now it's the wonderful oil yield that we're getting because that has such value now with renewable diesel and all that. There's all kinds of things like that.
Yeah. So do you have any particular insights or comment you'd like to make as we come to a close?
Well, I would say that, the ethanol industry is really working for farmers. We are an industry that is based on the farm because that's where our feedstock comes from. But to me, that's where it ought to come from. If you look at a field of corn, that's the best solar collector there is. It does such a fabulous job of collecting solar energy and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and turning it into oxygen for us. That's a great thing to be doing. And we get to provide energy, we get to provide feed for our livestock, we get to provide, fuel for other things. It's a wonderful thing to be in that ties right back to the farm. And
in a way, ethanol is a calling?
Yes. Yes, it was.
It was a calling for you. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Randy, for taking the time to chat and tell some stories about your experiences and some of the things you've learned and some of the insights. It's kind of fun to hear these from the pioneers in the industry. Thank you much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbiinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbiinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarsky, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.